Hello everyone and welcome to week 9 of Poll 205 Women in Politics. This week we're discussing women's reproductive health rights. This week there's an optional documentary to watch which I highly encourage you to see if you have a Netflix account. In this film, Reversing Roe, the filmmakers investigate the decades-long political battle to overturn the 1973 Supreme Court case Roe v. Wade, which granted women the right to an abortion. So in this video lecture, we're specifically going to focus on topics including the politicization of childbearing, gender and medical modernization, the intersection of sex and power with respect to regulating women's bodies, careers, and opportunities. We're also going to talk about the Great Right Turn, explaining religious influence in American politics, and then we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the current state of abortion in the United States and its implications. So, with all that being said, let's go ahead and get started. Now, to really set the stage for today's lecture, I want to begin by taking a brief detour in American history. So prior to the Civil War, abortion and contraceptives were completely illegal in the United States. And during this era, the people who offered reproductive health care services and delivered children were almost exclusively women, and this profession was known as midwifery. And let's chat about this profession for a moment. Midwives have been regarded among historians as one of the oldest prostitutions in the world. Fun fact, second only to prostitution. But the profession of midwifery is significant because throughout most of human history, it has predominantly been women who have served their communities as midwives, and they were considered esteemed members of society. So while ordinary women have generally been treated as second-class citizens, women who were midwives were often considered as highly prestigious, even sacred figures in their communities. However, we begin to see attitudes towards midwives decline rapidly after the Civil War in the United States during the era of medical modernization. And keep in mind, it wasn't even until the early 1900s that germ theory was popularized or even widely practiced among doctors in the United States. So it's during this time that we see the professionalization of medicine really take off. Medical schools and institutes are popping up all over the country, and notably, women are denied admission to these institutes of higher learning. And there's a lot of really unfortunate reasoning for all of this, right? Women were banned from attending medical school because of gender stereotypes, that it was more important for women to focus on being mothers than pursuing an education, that the medical profession was too physically demanding for women to handle, and that women were intellectually inferior and couldn't handle the rigor and demands of medical school. But eventually we get to a point when it comes to women's reproductive health care, we have two sets of actors fighting for control over this market. So on one side, you have a bunch of affluent, highly educated male doctors who are professionally trained in obstetrics. And on the other hand, you have women practicing midwifery who do not have the same elevated social status that comes along with being highly affluent or well educated. And keeping in mind that also during this time, women still have very few political rights. I mean, the 19th Amendment hasn't even been passed yet. So it's not surprising that these male doctors in obstetrics were able to use their political power to lobby the government into outlawing midwifery across the 50 states so that women would have no other option but to begin seeing obstetricians for their reproductive health care. In fact, many of these regulations persist today. In 7 states, Alabama, Illinois, Iowa, Kentucky, Nebraska, North Carolina, and South Dakota, home birth midwifery is totally illegal. And 23 states require physician oversight of nurse midwives. This in turn has led to many stereotypes about the competency and qualifications of nurse midwives in the United States, such as they, are less educated or they have less formal training, they can't prescribe medicine, they only deliver at patients' homes, or that care ceases after delivery. All of these are untrue. Both midwives and obstetricians are trained medical professionals who assist women before, during, and after childbirth. The main difference being that midwives don't manage high-risk pregnancies or perform C-sections. And to understand how the reputation of midwives deteriorated so rapidly in the United States, we only need to look at how prominent medical professionals spoke to the capabilities of midwives. So let's introduce Dr. Joseph DeLee, a prominent 20th century obstetrician who had some pretty dark shit to say about childbirth. As an obstetrician, Dr. DeLee noted that obstetric complications and deaths were so common that he, quote, often wondered whether nature did not intend women should be used up in the process of reproduction, in a matter analogous to that of the salmon, which dies after spawning. Perhaps laceration, prolapse, and all the evils are, in fact, natural to labor and, in fact, normal. If you adopt this view, I have no ground to stand on, but if you believe that a woman after delivery should be as healthy as well as anatomically perfect as she was before, and that the child should be undamaged, then you will have to agree with me that labor is pathogenic, because experience has proved such ideal results exceedingly rare. I don't know about you, but I would not want to see a doctor whose basic philosophy was, just don't think the human body is really meant to do this thing, so you might die in the process, but that's just the way it goes. And that's why representation matters so much. When we're talking about it just equity, equality, healthcare, politics, representation, all of that, right? I think this is a really good example of that. Also, in 1915, at the annual meeting of the American Association for the Study and Prevention of Infant Mortality, Dr. DeLee said that midwives stunted the progress of the obstetrical profession and that he refused to take part in the education of a provider that lowered the standards of the profession. If obstetrics were seen as dignified work that could draw more than the menial fees charged by midwives, Dr. DeLee said, many young physicians would be willing to deliver the patients that were under the care of midwives. And in an excerpt from this speech, Dr. DeLee stated that, quote, the midwife is a relic of barbarism. In civilized countries, the midwife is wrong, has always been wrong. The midwife has been a drag on the progress of the science and art of obstetrics. Her existence stunts the one and degrades the other. For many centuries, she perverted obstetrics from obtaining any standing at all among the science of medicine. And so the exit of midwives from women's reproductive health care had significant consequences. This sex divide and struggle for power between male-dominated obstetrics and female-dominated midwives would only sharpen over the course of American history. And so beginning with the delegitimization and subsequent banning of the female-dominated occupation of midwifery, misogyny and racism would become intrinsically characteristic of the American Medical Association's oversight of women's reproductive health care, which would not begin admitting women doctors until 1915 and black doctors until the 1960s. Also, keep in mind that since we're talking about the post-Civil War era, many states, particularly those in the Deep South, had enacted Jim Crow laws, which segregated practically all aspects of life on the basis of race. So not only were schools, restaurants, and public parks racially segregated, but even in death. Many southern cities segregated their cemeteries as well. And until the 1960s, it was also perfectly legal for hospitals to refuse service to Black Americans. It is this history of racism and discrimination that continues to have severe health consequences for women of color when they are pregnant, which we'll talk about at the end of the lecture. So when we try to understand early anti-abortion narratives in this country, we need to understand who retained power in society, and more importantly, we need to understand what lengths the ruling class was willing to go to in order to keep it that way. So today, anti-abortion narrative mainly centers on a message of morality, but in the late 19th century, physicians from the American Medical Association, or the AMA, were much more blunt in their reasoning for banning abortions. So to reiterate, the main reasons physicians wanted to ban abortion was not due to moral objections or health concerns. Instead, their reasoning centered squarely on power and control. Documented physician testimonies to state legislatures as to why abortion should be outlawed included statements such as, Men were becoming increasingly fearful of women's changing social roles. Husbands believed that if women were in charge of their own fertility, that this would encourage women to play more of a public role and less of a household role. And lastly, most abortions were performed on middle-class married white women, and many of these white physicians thus expressed the concern that allowing abortion to continue would curtail childbearing among these women and threaten the white race. And if you want to read more about these terrifying testimonials, I've included some source material in this lecture so that you can read more about it yourself. But what I'm attempting to do here in this lecture is to paint a picture of what women's reproductive health rights looked like before the Supreme Court heard the seminal Roe versus Wade case in 1973. And so far, it's not a pretty picture. And in fact, it's about to get a lot worse. Before the court decided Roe versus Wade, it was extraordinarily common for women, particularly those of color and those who were poor, to be coerced into sterilization during the abortion procedure. Coerced sterilization of women was so common in the South that it was referred to as the Mississippi appendectomy, likening the irreversible procedure of sterilizing another human being to the simple and routine practice of removing someone's appendix. And if you're wondering how people were coerced into becoming sterilized, well, the government had endless tricks up its sleeve. If the state deemed you to be a certain demographic unworthy of reproducing, it could threaten you with denial of social welfare benefits, denial of medical care for, other issues. If you needed an abortion, you would have to first agree to be sterilized. And if you were admitted to a mental health institution, getting sterilized was often a part of the admission process. And if you're thinking to yourself, wow, coerced sterilization sounds an awful lot like eugenics, then you'd be totally right. Eugenics is defined as the practice of improving the human species by selectively mating people with specific desirable hereditary traits. This also means using certain methods, such as sterilization, to prevent undesirable populations from procreating. And in our country, we have a long, awful history of engaging in this practice. And in the early 1900s, immigrants, homosexuals, the mentally ill, unmarried women, poor women, and even young girls in juvenile detention were frequently sterilized in order to keep these individuals from reproducing. In fact, Nazi Germany eugenics program was largely inspired by what we were doing in the United States. And frighteningly, to this day, the practice of eugenics is still technically legal due to the Supreme Court's decision in Buck versus Bell, which has never been overturned. We're not going to get too much into that, but only once the horrors and atrocities of the Nazis came to light after World War II did eugenics begin to lose support among Americans in the United States. And unfortunately, this era of history isn't quite behind us yet. Whistleblowers across the United States have come forward over the last few years documenting how immigrant women are being sterilized in our ICE detention facilities before being deported back to their home country. So when it comes to reproductive rights and freedoms, our country has a really long way to go. So as we've seen so far in this lecture, from about 1890 to 1950, anti-abortion policy was largely rooted in the preservation of white racial identity and women's domesticity. But during second wave feminism in the 1960s, we begin to see political parties taking a more active stance on abortion. And as pointed out in the optional documentary Reversing Roe, Republicans, which have historically been for the party of limited government, passed some of the most expansive laws legalizing abortion. In fact, when Ronald Reagan was governor of California, he was lauded for passing the most comprehensive laws in the country securing women's right to an abortion. But by the time 1980 rolled around, the political landscape on abortion would be unrecognizable, and it would morph into a major mainstream religious issue. And in the next part of the lecture, I want to discuss how and why abortion became so intertwined with politics and religion, particularly in the 1980s and beyond. But before we do that, I want to get ready to introduce our stop and think moment. Now, of course, abortion and reproductive rights are one of the most controversial issues in American politics right now. And I want to be sure that we stay on track in the discussion boards this week. I don't want to see a lot of debate over, whether abortion is a moral issue or a civil rights issue, or if being pro-life is better than being pro-choice. What I really want us to do is to frame our discussion through the concept of reproductive justice, which is defined as the right to make decisions about one's own sexuality, fertility, and reproduction. reproduction. And what does it mean when we allow the government to make these decisions instead of the individual? What are the consequences of such decision making? Keeping in mind that when you control someone's fertility, you are also denying individuals the right to build their own families on their own timeline. You're controlling how much of an education they can have. You're influencing the likelihood that they will live in poverty. Remember when we talked about the feminization of poverty? You're shaping life opportunities available to that individual. You're denying individuals the right to make decisions about their own bodies, and you're interfering with doctors' ability to treat their patients. So for the stop and think, I'd like you to consider some of these prompts. How does the concept of reproductive justice differ from pro-life and pro-choice positions on abortion? How does abortion access intersect with issues of race, class, and economic inequality? And in your opinion, will abortion always be a religious issue, or is the narrative starting to shift again as it has in the past? So go ahead and pause the video, reflect on these prompts, and when you're ready to resume, go ahead and hit play. All right, in this last part of the lecture, I want to provide a brief introduction onto how and why abortion has become such a major religious issue in the United States, and how the Republican Party in particular has become the mouthpiece for conservative Christianity, a transformation that historians and political scientists have coined as the Great Right Turn. So beginning in the 1960s, the Democratic Party becomes enamored with the youth cultural revolution and political activism that's taking place across college campuses. So here we're talking about protesting the Vietnam War or getting engaged with the civil rights movement. Democrats no longer saw the value of courting the working class or the FDR era social policy. The Republican Party for decades was the party of the wealthy elite. So Democrats thought to themselves, working class Americans would never, ever vote for Republicans. So let's try to expand our base. And let's try to get some of these college-educated, politically active students involved with the Democratic Party. And thanks to these FDR-era policies, more people than ever before were attending college. And this produced an enormous social ripple effect that began dividing America into two social classes, the educated and the uneducated. And so by the 1980s, sociologists and historians like Paul Fussell began documenting the rise of a new social class of Americans, which he called X people. So for Fussell, X people were young, highly educated, extremely affluent, above mainstream fads. They created their own trends, right? They bought the best wine and they went to the fanciest restaurants. They were the creatives, the artists, the intellectuals, a new class of elites that were interestingly, surprisingly politically liberal, because up until this time, if you had money, if you had wealth, if you had status, it was in your best interest to vote with the Republican Party. But these individuals were unique. They were uniquely politically liberal. In 2002, Richard Florida wrote how the creative class grew to dominate American political and social culture. The hyper-educated, politically liberal creative class espoused the ideals of diversity, equality, justice, and tolerance. They moved to metropolitan cities and with them brought a new way of thinking, lessons on political correctness and the right way to think about life, society, and politics. And, today we know this class by many names. We might call them yuppies or hipsters or even woke radical leftists. They're all basically the same thing. They grew to dominate culture, media, film, tech, education, with their focus on intersectionality and political correctness. And what I want to emphasize is that this entire identity is saturated with privilege and affluence. It is a completely unrelatable paradigm for the average working class American. So, the X people, the creative class, yuppies, hipsters, woke leftists, whatever you want to call them, in their pursuit of this high-class city life, they generated an enormous impact on the geopolitical composition of the United States. Consider this. The 50 largest metropolitan areas in the world house only 7% of the world's population, but generate 40% of global wealth. Just 6 metropolitan areas, San Francisco, New York City, Boston, D.C., San Diego, and London, attract about 50% of all high-tech capital investment and the world. What this means is that metropolitan areas blossom while rural areas languish. And thus we end up with two classes of people in our society, liberals who live in metropolitan areas and conservatives who live in rural areas that are essentially operating in different universes. And this is one of the reasons why political polarization is so extreme and why we've lost the ability to talk to each other and understand and empathize with one another, depending on where we live, where we grow up, and where we come from. The final nail in the coffin that drove working class voters out of the Democratic Party was NAFTA, the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, which was designed to open free trade between Canada, United States, and Mexico. Now, what's interesting about NAFTA is that it was actually an idea spearheaded by Republicans, notably by President Ronald Reagan and his predecessor Bush Sr. But it wouldn't be until Democrat President Bill Clinton took office that NAFTA would finally be signed into law. And again, the purpose was to encourage economic activity between U.S., Mexico, and Canada with reduced or eliminated tariffs. But in reality, many manufacturing jobs left the U.S. to pursue cheaper labor in Mexico, which led to monumental job losses in the United States. And so by the time we get to the early 2000s, the Democratic Party was unrecognizable from its earlier populist progressive agenda. Instead of protecting and promoting the needs of the working class, it had become the party of the highly educated, affluent Americans in the knowledge economy, which we refer to as, intellectuals, doctors, professors, engineers, big tech. It became the party of socially liberal ideologies that center on cosmopolitanism and identity. It became the party of the metropolises. And it became the party that advocated for trade policies that outsource American jobs. Now, happening alongside this, all simultaneously, we have evangelical Christians who are growing increasingly frustrated with American politics. And most of this animosity was directed towards the Supreme Court, which had banned school prayer, banned the 10 Commandments from courthouses and classrooms, desegregated communities and schools, implemented forced busing, and granted women the right to an abortion, which was the huge one that really got evangelicals really involved in politics. During this time, religious leaders had begun establishing segregation academies in the late 1960s to educate white children only. These leaders encouraged their congregations to vote for more religious politicians. And after Roe versus Wade, Paul Weyrich, an American religious conservative activist, called upon his bloc of voters, which would come to be known as the moral majority, to become more active in politics and restore the moral fabric of our country. And so after 1964, when all of this is happening, the Republican Party recognizes that Southern Democrats who are hostile to desegregation policies are drifting from the Democratic Party, and they see an opportunity. In 1968, Nixon appeals to working class Southerners by emphasizing how Democrats are destroying the education system through desegregation. Democrats only care about the minority vote through the civil rights movement, their emphasis on the civil rights movement, and white Southerners who are working class are not a priority to Democrats. So if we look at the 1964 electoral map, we see overwhelmingly Americans voting for the Democrat Johnson, but we see this shift beginning to happen in the Deep South, where for the first time ever, the Republican Party is winning in the Deep South. And by the time we get to 1972, we've seen a utter and complete transformation, how Nixon had transformed rural America's relationship with the Republican Party. In 1980, Reagan begins building upon Nixon's strategy by emphasizing the need to return to a form of governance that prioritized states' rights over a more powerful federal government. He co-opted a lot of religious messaging, so he would often use the biblical imagery comparing America as a city on a hill. He frequently called for a spiritual revival in the United States, emphasized America as a Christian nation, as well as working class values, right? Things like family, tradition. And perhaps most significantly, Reagan changes his stance on abortion in light of the Supreme Court's decision in Roe versus Wade, which enraged the conservative Christians that Reagan was trying so hard to mobilize in the 1980 election. Now let's talk about Roe versus Wade here for a moment. Norma McCorvey, who used the alias of Jane Roe due to the high-profile nature and controversy of the case, sued the Dallas District Attorney Henry Wade, alleging the Texas law which banned abortion without exception was unconstitutional, particularly on the basis of the Ninth Amendment in the U.S. Constitution. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the Ninth Amendment, all you need to know is that this was a special amendment added to the Constitution that specifically states that the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. In other words, just because a right isn't explicitly mentioned in the Constitution doesn't mean that it is inherently not a right of the people. So even though the Constitution makes no mention of abortion, McCorvey's legal team argued that a woman's right to an abortion should be legally protected under the Ninth Amendment. And the Supreme Court agreed. Ever since the Roe decision, the Supreme Court has generally interpreted the Ninth Amendment as a fundamental right to privacy, which has opened the door to a plethora of constitutional protections, such as the right to an abortion, access to birth control, which many states actually banned in the 1960s, the right to refuse medical treatments, and all kinds of stuff. However, as we'll see in a moment, the current Supreme Court has demonstrated through recent rulings that it is deviating away from this interpretation of the Ninth Amendment, which made the Dobbs decision possible. But overall, the decision in Roe banned state regulation of abortion with limits on the third trimester. Since the case, there have been countless efforts to regulate abortion or efforts to reverse Roe. So after the Supreme Court's decision in Roe versus Wade, the court would hear more than 50 seminal cases on abortion and contraceptives. That's approximately one case per year. And so early challenges to Roe were actually quite liberal. In fact, they actually expanded abortion access, such as Bigelow versus Virginia in 1975, which struck down advertising bans for abortion clinics, and Bellotti versus Baird in 1979, which struck down provisions requiring teenagers to seek parental permission to have an abortion. However, as conservative Christians became more active in politics, the Supreme Court rulings on abortion also became more conservative. In the case of Harris versus McRae in 1980, the Supreme Court decided that federal funds or taxpayer dollars could not be used for abortions. We have the Webster versus Reproductive Health Services case in 1989, which forbade abortions in public facilities unless the mother's life was in danger. It required physicians to perform viability tests after 20 weeks. These last two cases, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on, but they're really, really interesting. The documentary talks about these cases in a lot more detail and explains why they're significant and what the implications of them were. So again, if you want to know more about this, definitely check out the documentary this week. And finally, we come to the notorious Dobbs versus Jackson case, which the Supreme Court decided in June 2022. And for a bit of context regarding the case, Mississippi passes the Gestational Age Act in 2018, which banned abortions after 15 weeks. The Mississippi law directly violated the legal precedent set in Roe and Casey, which argued that abortion is a protected right up until fetal viability, which is about 20 weeks. In the Dobbs case, Justice Alito argued that nowhere in the Constitution is abortion mentioned as a protected right. And although this is true, it flies in the face of what the Ninth Amendment stands for, just as we discussed a moment ago. And in a 5-4 ruling, the Supreme Court upheld the Mississippi law, thus essentially overturning more than 50 years of precedent established in Roe versus Wade. And soon after the decision was handed down, several states adopted laws that drastically limited the availability of abortions. So currently, abortion is completely illegal in 14 states and only protected by law in about 23 states. Since the Dobbs decision, states with some of the most restrictive abortion bans, like Texas, force women to carry unviable pregnancies, even against the advice of medical professionals. This has led to a dramatic narrative shift among pro-choice advocates that focuses less on abortion as a method for terminating unwanted pregnancies, and instead now centers much more heavily on women who desperately want to have children, experience complications during pregnancy, and then face the threat of infertility because physicians are too afraid that they will face criminal charges if they terminate an unviable pregnancy. So 2 years after the U.S. Supreme Court revoked the constitutional right to abortion through the Dobbs decision, an increasingly robust body of evidence is emerging that illustrates the myriad of harms caused and exacerbated by the Dobbs decision. Several dozen peer-reviewed studies and other rigorous research conducted since June 2022 illustrate the impact of Dobbs, including data on changes in clinic numbers, abortion incidents, and travel for abortion care. And perhaps most disturbingly, maternal deaths have spiked in states with strict restrictions on abortion. In fact, public health experts argue that the United States leads in maternal death rates among all developed countries, for precisely the reasons we've discussed in today's lecture: the demonization and delegitimization of nurse midwives, historic gender and race-based discrimination in American medical institutions, and strict anti-abortion policies that put the lives of pregnant women in danger. Unfortunately, there are a plethora of factors that explain why maternal mortality is so high in this country. Because the wealth gap is so extreme in this country, many women are waiting until much later in life to have children, which increases the risk of complications. They're instead prioritizing getting an education and becoming economically secure in their careers first. Over 50% of pregnancies in the United States are unplanned, which is not only a function of our country's abysmal sexual education program. By the way, if you want to talk about what your sexual education program was like in high school or middle school, please feel free to share that, because I'm always amazed at how students, I'm always amazed that nothing has changed, that y'all are essentially getting the same sex ed that I got in rural Georgia in like the early 2000s. Like it's terrifying. But this also means that chronic health issues often go undiagnosed or untreated until very late in one's pregnancy, considering that over half of pregnancies are unplanned. Navigating our healthcare system is a nightmare, which means that some pregnant people really struggle to access adequate prenatal care. And maternal mortality rates are generally 2 to 3 times higher for women of color compared to white women. So differences in healthcare coverage, access to care, and documented bias in how physicians treat women of color reporting complications all play a major role in these healthcare inequities. So in closing out our lecture today, I know we talked about a lot. Here are some final thoughts I'd like you to consider regarding the implications of everything that we've discussed today. So how do historical events such as the American Medical Association's lobbying to ban abortion to preserve the white race or coerced sterilization programs influence contemporary discussions about reproductive justice? Or if this was your first time hearing about these events, how do you think the debate on abortion would change in this country if more people were aware of this history? Second, how do abortion restrictions affect public health, including maternal mortality, unsafe abortion practices, and mental health outcomes? And then lastly, what are the social and economic implications of unintended pregnancies for individuals, families, and communities, particularly in states with restrictive abortion laws? Well, everyone, that's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this lecture and learned something new. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.